Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm really thrilled to be here. I have a lot of information to share with you, so I'm just going to dive right in. And that was a wonderful introduction. I have a little slide about me to get deeper into that. But let's talk about aquatic invasive species prevention in our freshwater habitat. So first, I want to mention Pennsylvania Sea Grant and our mission as well. We are focused on promoting the sustainability of Pennsylvania's ecological and economic coastal watershed resources through science-based education, research, and outreach. We are built on a system that is funded by the federal government through NOAA, and that money is trickled down to a land grant university, and this system that I'm talking about exists in 34 states across the United States. Basically, any state that touches an ocean or has a Great Lakes coastline has a Sea Grant program. So in Sea Grant, Pennsylvania, we have, a small bit of the Lake Erie watershed, but a tiny bit of ocean coast, just not really, but little, and 86,000 miles of rivers and streams in between. So we're very fortunate to have a program in Pennsylvania, even though it might be kind of small. Our facilitator for the NOAA funding in Pennsylvania is Penn State University. So that I'm technically employed by Penn State University, but I work as a Sea Grant staff member. And just a little bit more about me. Nice to meet everyone on here. Maybe someday I can come in person. But as Erin said, I'm a coastal outreach specialist and a volunteer coordinator. So my job is to provide outreach materials about current research regarding aquatic invasive species. And I do that pretty much on the western half of the United States, or Pennsylvania. Sorry, I'm not that cool. But I also do some statewide efforts where I serve on multiple committees that are regional and statewide regarding aquatic invasive species and water quality. And as a volunteer coordinator, I coordinate a group of volunteers called Master Watershed Stewards through Penn State Extension, and they are located up in northwestern PA. I technically cover the counties of Erie, Warren, and Crawford County, and I get to work with a group of wonderful coordinators across the state that also coordinate volunteer programs. And there's probably some near you that you could join forces with and combine efforts, because the mission statement or missions are very similar. So this is a picture of me in a creek. I'm actually in Spring Creek in Center County. And you can see that I am definitely happiest with my shoes off and my hands full of plants, trying to identify them or trying to find critters in the water. I love being in the water, and this is a natural fit for me to be educating people about aquatic invasive species. So that brings me to tonight's agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about aquatic invasive species and their impacts. Then we'll move into vectors of spread, which is how they move around. And we'll talk about prevention techniques that each of us can do every single day to ensure they don't spread further. Then we'll talk about specific species, so raising a little bit of species awareness about species that are in your location. And then we'll talk about some resources that Sea Grant has available and ways that you can report any sightings of these species. And I'll stop periodically for questions, but like Erin said, I encourage you to, if you have any questions, type them in the chat, or when we pause, go off mute. This is a great way for us to have a conversation. So diving right in with some definitions, invasive species are a non-native, but also that means they're introduced, and I'll get to more about that later. They're non-native species that causes an ecologic, economic, or health-related impact. So they're doing some kind of damage to the new world that they're in, whether that is ecological, economic, or health-related. And this in-between species is what I call introduced. So an introduced species is a species that is not native to the area, but doesn't necessarily cause any damage. And a great example is this beautiful magnolia tree. It's a non-native variety with those pink flowers. It doesn't cause any damage, but it doesn't necessarily provide the benefits to the surrounding ecosystem that a native species does. And thereby, a native species is indigenous to a given region, meaning that its presence in the region is the result of local natural evolution. And what that means is that species has evolved over time with all of the other organisms that are native to that area. It has a place in that ecosystem, in that food web. It supports ecosystem services that are required and necessary for the functionality of our ecosystems. And they sometimes have cultural significance. And a great example here is the native pickerel weed that you see in the background. So this whole concept that we're talking about tonight, aquatic invasive species, is considered one of the greatest threats to aquatic biodiversity worldwide. Um, Ever since people started traveling a lot, continent to continent, state to state, we've seen the spread of invasive species, and it is really impacting the biodiversity of our natural habitats. So this is a challenge that worldwide scientists, outreach specialists, researchers are all working on. And just to keep this in mind for the duration of the presentation, some species are native to one area of a state and invasive in another area of a state. They don't follow human boundaries. They pretty much follow watershed boundaries, which we know don't follow human boundaries, like counties, states, things like that. So a great example here is the flathead catfish, which is invasive where you all are located on the eastern half of the state, and it's actually native where I am, over here in the Lake Erie watershed and the Ohio River drainage. So let's talk a little bit about what makes a species invasive. They typically have a really set list of characteristics. They are typically highly adaptable to their new environments. So something like Phragmites here can grow in some of the most polluted soils. They prefer degraded soils, and they also have learned to release toxins into the soils around them to prevent the growth of other plants. Invasive species are also typically voracious and generalist feeders. And what that means is they eat a lot and they eat in like a lot of different food categories. So when I describe this to students, what I usually use is a pizza analogy, and everyone has their preferred type of topping. But the round gobies in this situation are generalist feeders. They eat any kind of topping, it doesn't matter. But they also eat a lot. And round gobies are one of the best examples of voracious feeders because they have adapted to forage in complete darkness. And that's not something that our native fish typically do. So they have longer times of the day and night where they're eating a lot of food, and they are eating whatever food that they can fit in their mouth, essentially. The next characteristic on this list is high fecundity. And what that means is a high reproductive rate. So the best example that I have of this is not listed on the slide in a picture, but if anyone's heard of zebra mussels, which are invasive in the Great Lakes region, they've invaded almost every Great Lake, and one of the reasons that they have been able to do that is because one female zebra mussel can lay 1 million eggs in a season. So they reproduce very quickly, very rapidly, and in some cases, some of these species reproduce it multiple times in a year. The next characteristic on our list is high growth rate. So that just means that they reach maturity or they grow faster than our native species. And a great example here is this aquatic plant, hydrilla. We're going to talk a lot more about hydrilla later, but hydrilla is one of those invasive species that can actually grow up to 1 inch per day under the right circumstances. So extremely high growth rate, has the ability to really take over a water body. And then the next characteristic is that these species are typically responsive to changes in the environment around them. So this is a little bit different than being adaptable. A responsive species means that they're going to change their habits when the environment around them changes. So for example, with the climate changing around us and things trending warmer, the invasive species that are responsive to changes in the habitat like that are going to do much better because they have the ability to respond to those changes in the environment. Whereas some of our native species might not necessarily have those characteristics and capabilities. And then finally on this list, we have that invasive species typically have less predator pressure. So this can be for multiple reasons, but typically it is because the species is new to an environment. So it takes the other organisms in the food chain a little while to figure out if they can eat it, and should they eat it. So in some cases, though, they have no predator pressure. So for example, the New Zealand mud snail over here, which we'll also talk about later, has no known predators, and it's invading and popping up all over Pennsylvania because nothing's really eating it, and it has some pretty, dare I say, cool characteristics that enable it to survive that we'll talk about later. So all of this brings us to the invasion pathway. So when you think about all of those characteristics of an invasive species, those are the things that enable them to survive a variety of situations to become invasive. Because remember, all of these species have a home somewhere, and in their home, they have a natural spot in the food chain, in that ecosystem. So if we look at this invasion pathway, you can see the species pool at the top tier of this inverted triangle. In the species pool, this would be in their native habitat. You have a lot of these bluefish that are kind of the normal species that don't have the genetic makeup with those more aggressive characteristics that I talked about on the previous slide. But then you have this red pool of fish, I guess they're technically yellowfish, that have those characteristics, and you see them survive a variety of situations. So the first thing that they have to survive is transportation. So in order for a species to become invasive, it has to be introduced somewhere. Well, that introduction has to happen by some kind of means of transportation. So some of these species during the transportation will not survive. So our species pool gets a little bit smaller. And once they're introduced, they have to be able to reproduce in that new habitat in order to continue to thrive as a species. So not all of them are going to be able to reproduce. So our species pool gets even smaller. And then finally, after they're the ones that survive and are able to reproduce are there, they're considered to be established. Now, those established species can maintain in their environment right where they are, but they become invasive when they start spreading outside that location. And only a small amount of the original species pool will actually start to invade other areas. But it's all based on those original characteristics. They're aggressive, they're generalist feeders, they have a high reproduction rate, high growth rate. All of those things enable them to kind of climb this inverted triangle and become the most invasive of their kind in that area and cause a lot of problems. So you can kind of see how they're also really difficult to manage because of some of these reasons. And we'll get to that later. So now that we know what they are and what they look like, let's talk a little bit about how they impact the environment. So one of the biggest impacts that invasive species have is that they take resources from native species. The pie of resources in an ecosystem is only so big. You know, there is limited amounts of food, shelter, access to sunlight, nutrients in the water, and even things like spawning sites. Our non-native species, when they are introduced, are invasive and non-native species, whenever they're introduced, they increase that competition for that finite amount of resources. So they're causing a lot of competition. And because they are more aggressive typically, and they do, feed on multiple types of food, and they're just adapting really well, they're typically going to outcompete our native species. Invasive species also cause the alteration of habitats. So they can cause a wetland that's kind of open in the middle. If you have an invasion of Phragmites, you can actually watch that wetland turn from a wetland to a a non-navigable wetland. So there's so much Phragmites that you can't even walk through it. And that can happen in a matter of just a couple years. They also shade out native species if they're growing too thickly on the surface of the water. That prevents sunlight from blocking or from going beneath the surface of the water and providing sunlight to the algae and the plants on the bottom of a water body that really, really need it. Another thing that they can do, and I have a video to show you here, is completely change a landscape. Like I mentioned with the Phragmites, but if you're thinking about an underwater species, the rusty crayfish can create what's called an aquatic desert. And what that means is that nothing can grow there, nothing can exist there other than this species. So let me play this video for you. See if I can get it to work. Oh, I practiced, I promise. Okay, I'm gonna exit out so that, okay, there it is. I needed this little arrow to pop up. Okay, so this camera's a little wavy, so I apologize for that. If you're seasick, don't watch. He's gonna dip it under the water and you'll see the massive infestation of rusty crayfish that are living on top of one another. So there you can see them all. That's the only thing that's there. This portion of the river, and I apologize, I don't know where this was taken, but the rusty crayfish have completely changed this habitat. There's no vegetation, which means that no fish can live there. They can't lay their eggs there. There's no macroinvertebrates. So it really, truly can completely alter a landscape. There are also economic impacts with invasive species, and they're pretty hefty. So this is just a list of the costs to shoreline businesses, industries, and communities. And you can see just some of these statistics are staggering. There are about $1.2 million spent every single year on power plants, one power plant around the Great Lakes to monitor and control just zebra mussels. And then thinking about aquaculture related industries, about $29.6 million are spent for aquaculture related impacts on invasive species in the Great Lakes. But let's look at a more Pennsylvania statistic. So I assume everyone here either likes to recreate on water, goes fishing, or goes boating. Whether you do or not, it is a very, very economically important industry in Pennsylvania. Recreational boating has been valued at $4.5 billion and is ranked 19th in the United States. And the recreational angling in just my county, in Erie County alone, was valued at close to $50 million back in 2016. So it's probably much higher now. And when we think about the threat that invasive species can pose to a multi-billion-dollar industry, any threat to the food web, to our native species, to those recreational fisheries is a huge issue that we want to stay on top of. So next I'm going to talk about vectors of spread, which are the ways that these aquatic invasive species get from place to place. Let's think about them on a more global scale, and then we'll pare it down to local. So just for an example here, this is a Great Lakes example. So I apologize, I meant to take the slide out and I forgot, but it's important information. So the Caspian Sea region is located in Eurasia, and about 2/3 of the non-native species introductions that we have in the Great Lakes come from this region. And this is a great setup to talk about why, because typically we are receiving a lot of cargo ships from the Caspian Sea region that are holding ballast water. So the ballast water is pulled in at the source port, so maybe in the Caspian Sea region. And in that ballast water at the source port, there might be a ton of small, even microscopic organisms that then travel with that ballast water to the destination port. Say that destination port is Erie. When they are changing the cargo around, they have to balance out the boat. So they start discharging the water. And all of those organisms that have survived that journey are discharged into that new location. So that's on a bigger scale how some of these aquatic organisms get around. And you would think like because they're from the sea in some cases that they wouldn't survive in fresh water, but because they're highly adaptable and responding to their environment and aggressive, they can sometimes survive. And then they become a new invasive species that we worry about. So thinking about more locally, aquatic invasive species are expert hitchhikers and not the kind that go out with their thumb, but they do grab on to things. So they're not like, you know, consensual hitchhikers. They will come without permission. Um, they will grab onto your boats, your motors, your gear, and they can be microscopic. They oftentimes, look like this. This could be vegetation that is invasive and native, but you could also have tiny larval stages of invasive fish wrapped in this vegetation. You could have small mussels or snails. They also hitch a ride through bait buckets. This is a pretty big route or vector of spread. So it's important to think about how we're using our bait and what we do with it when we're done. But a lot of the behavior currently is to purchase the bait at the bait shop, and then you go fishing, you use it, and then when you're done with it, you toss it in the water. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the best practice to prevent invasive species, so we will talk about what you can do instead. And then finally, the last vector of spread that I wanted to mention is a direct movement of species between water bodies. This is something that people do on purpose. Sometimes it's because someone desires a particular fish species or turtle or even frogs, amphibians, things like that. They desire those species in their local water body. So if they see it and they're out somewhere else, they'll grab it and they'll put it in their local waterway. This can be a spread of invasive species, but it can also spread bacteria and pathogens and create a lot of competition between the other organisms in that waterway. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is prevention. So this is where, something that we can do to prevent the spread of these invasive species. So now that we understand those vectors of spread, we can basically interrupt them and develop habits and behaviors that interrupt those vectors of spread so that they can't spread around. Before we talk about prevention, let's understand how important it is. So the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is very accurate in the invasive species world. So this chart is called the invasion curve, and it is one of those things that looks really overwhelming, but easy to break down once you know what you're looking at. So on the bottom, we have time. So over time, you see the area infested increase, and as the area infested increase, the control costs also increase. And on our time scale, you have prevention. So prevention is occurring. It's very low cost because the area is not yet infested. And there are, you have the species are absent. So basically you're preventing the introduction of these invasive species. At some point, things happen and there's an introduction. So at first, you can eradicate that species if you catch it quickly enough because it's a small localized population. Eradication is possible during this time. But over time, if we are unable to eradicate it, we typically see a rapid increase in distribution and abundance, and therefore eradication in this phase is unlikely. So you're looking at a management technique of containment. So you're trying to contain that spread so that it doesn't break out into your other surrounding natural resources. And eventually, if containment is not successful, you have that invasive species become widespread and abundant, and long-term management is targeted at population suppression and resource protection. So you're really thinking about how to protect the resources that are the most valuable over the long term. So you can see why prevention is so important, because at each stage of this, not only does the invasive species population grow, but the control costs go way, way up. So let's look at each of those vectors of spread and talk about the prevention techniques we can use. One of the best things that you can do to prevent this situation, I mean, this is kind of unpreventable, but let's talk about what happens when we have this situation. You can do something called clean, drain, and dry. And this is a very simple and pretty much cost-free, effective technique that you can practice on any type of gear, whether you have a boat with a motor, a non-motorized boat, or any kind of gear. Even I tell people, do this with your hiking clothes and shoes. When you do a tick check when you leave the woods, if you've been walking near a stream, also do a little invasive species check on the bottoms of your boots. So this involves cleaning, draining, and drying. And that first step to clean is, you're looking all over the equipment or the vessel for any visible aquatic plants, mud, debris, things like that, before you leave the water access area. The next step is to drain. So you'll want to drain all water containing locations. That might be your bilge pump, your live wells that might contain air bubblers, and your motor, and any other water containing areas on your boat or within your equipment. You want to drain those before leaving the water access area. And then finally, the last step is to dry. So the recommendation is to dry your gear and your boats for at least 5 days, but this is not always possible. Many of us like to go from location to location, whether we are in a motorized boat or just going hiking around a watershed. So what you can do instead is wipe things down with a towel. I've even heard of people using a 5 to 10% bleach solution to run through the inner parts of their boat to make sure that they can reduce the possibility of spreading aquatic invasives. And then thinking back to that bait bucket full of crayfish. So if I asked you to look at that bait bucket and tell me which ones were invasive, do you think that you could do it? I certainly could not. And the same goes for minnows and other species like worms and things that we use for bait all the time. So the best thing to do is, instead of dumping it into the water or leaving it at the site, the best thing to do is to dispose of it in the trash, which it does seem like a waste. So if that doesn't sit right with you, you can always offer it to an angler that's in that same area and educate them on the dangers of dumping it back into the water. So encourage them to dump it in the trash when they're done. But the other thing that you can do, which an angler taught me this trick, if you're using minnows and you want to save them for later, you can salt the water and freeze them, and then you can take them and use them later for different fishing activities. You might not necessarily be fishing for the same thing that you were, because live bait and deceased bait are very different, but it's an alternative that doesn't get wasted. And then thinking back to how we're moving those species between waterways. So like I mentioned before, this can be a vector of spreading not just invasive species, but also diseases and pathogens that could impact native populations. So we never, ever want to move species between waterways, even if they're native. It's also important to think back to the beginning when I talked about how invasive species might, they don't follow human boundaries. So you could potentially be moving a species that is native in like one half of the state or one water drainage to an area where even just one county over, it is considered an invasive species. And regardless of the invasive or native species, when they're moved, again, they can increase the risk of disease and pathogens, but they also increase competition between new and existing populations, no matter where they're introduced. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions before I dive into talking about species that are very specific to your area. And I see there's 2 things in the chat, so I can check on those really quick. Oh, Erin, thank you for adding the Montgomery Master Watershed Steward Program.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe there may be a Philadelphia one as well. I'll look it up, but
There,
there may be a few folks from Philly here as well.
oh, great. Yes, there is a Philly program. There's a Berks Schuylkill program. I'm not sure how far Lehigh Valley is from you, but there's a Lehigh Valley program.
Yeah, and I went through it myself. So yeah, it's a really great program.
That's wonderful.
Any other, is it okay for folks to unmute if they have any questions too? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see one in the chat from Evan. So while folks are thinking of questions, let me answer Evan. He asks, is species transfer technically a crime from a legal perspective? So Evan, that is a great question, and I'd be interested to see if anyone here actually knows the answer. But I know that I can speak to crayfish. With crayfish, you are not allowed to move crayfish in the state of Pennsylvania, no matter if they're native or invasive, unless they have been completely deceased. So essentially, you have to remove the head behind the eye because they are so invasive and they thrive so well. But those rules might apply to other species, but I am not 100% sure. Other questions right now? Okay. All right. Well, let's dive into a couple very specific species. So, I was telling Aaron earlier that I reached out to the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, and I had asked them, what species should I focus on for this specific area? And Sean Hartzell from Fish and Boat, he's the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator with them for the entire state. He gave me some great ideas, and I couldn't decide which ones I wanted to feature, so I'm featuring all of them. So hopefully we don't go too far past the time of our allotted location or presentation time. The first one up is the New Zealand mud snail. So New Zealand mud snails, I've talked about a little bit. They were found a few years ago in Wissahickon Creek in a small amount. So this is something for everyone working in and around Wissahickon Creek to be very aware of. New Zealand mud snails are very tiny. They are on average, 0.1 to 0.2 inches. And you can see one on the tip of my finger here that we found in Erie County. They reproduce asexually, and that means that one snail can start a new infestation somewhere else because it doesn't need a partner to reproduce. And this is the really cool thing that I was going to tell you about that is cool, but it makes them really difficult to manage. They have something called an operculum, which is a covering that will cover this opening in their shell. And when they cover that operculum, they can actually seal themselves up and keep themselves moist enough to survive for several days outside of water. So New Zealand mud snails they reproduce rapidly and again asexually, and they are displacing native snails within the food web. And that creates a change in the food web and offers very little nutritional value to native fish that are needing to eat these tiny, tiny snails. So they can eat them, but they often don't process them and they don't gain any actual nutrients that are beneficial from eating New Zealand mud snails. And they do have water quality impacts as well. They can alter ecosystem structure by changing which snails are readily available in that ecosystem. And that can cause some natural cycles to change. Things like the nitrogen cycle can be changed when you have too many of these guys present, which causes all kinds of issues with water quality. New Zealand mud snails hitchhike on recreational boats, equipment, and wildlife. And this is the most amazing thing about them that I have seen so far. They can actually be transported within the gut of fish because that operculum that seals itself allows them to pass through the fish undigested. So there have been situations in Pennsylvania where there have been fish that have eaten a bunch of New Zealand mud snails, and then they were released into a new habitat. They were stalked intentionally, and they defecated the New Zealand mud snails in the new area, and they survived and created a new infestation. So it's a really, really tough one, which is why it's so important that we prevent its spread as much as we can. The best techniques to do that are the clean, drain, dry technique. You can also dry your gear for 5 days, but also you can freeze your gear overnight or up or minimum of 6 hours. And if you're going in between water bodies, the best thing that you can really do is soak your gear for 5 minutes in a 1-to-1 solution of 409 degreaser and natural water. And you don't want to release that water back into the environment. So if there's a slop sink nearby, or you can put a secure lid on it, you can take it back with you and dump it in a sink at home. So water chestnut is another invasive aquatic plant that you might find around your area. It's probably already there, but it's one to be very aware of. Water chestnut is very different than the thing that you would find maybe in a Chinese takeout. It can completely cover ponds, shallow lakes, and rivers because it forms very dense colonies. Water chestnut can be identified by a very specific looking rosette of floating leaves, which I'll show you in the next photo. It also has these finer feathery leaves that are submerged beneath the surface of the water, and this long taproot that does attach to the bottom of a pond. The water chestnut also produces these nuts or seeds. These seeds are extremely sharp and spiny, and they can actually penetrate shoe leather. So this is what that rosette of leaves looks like. It's very hard to miss once you know what you're looking for. Water chestnut is one of those that's tricky because it can grow pretty quickly. It can cover a lake or pond because it has a high reproductive rate, and each of those plants can produce 15 nuts in a season. And each of those nuts can sink to the bottom of a lake or pond and remain viable for up to 12 years. So it's a long-term management that you're talking about when you are managing water chestnut. It also can spread vegetatively through fragmentation, meaning that it can break off tiny pieces and float somewhere else. And one of those tiny pieces can start a new infestation somewhere else. Water chestnut is a huge issue for recreation. You can see in this photo how many plants have been removed in Bucks County and Lake Towhee. This was an extremely successful water chestnut pool, but it's something that they'll be monitoring for a very long time. And the amount of effort that goes into this, it cannot be understated. So another aquatic plant I wanted to feature is hydrilla, and we talked about this a little bit. It is considered nature's perfect weed because, as I mentioned before, it can grow up to 1 inch per day, and it spreads very fast, covering the surface of water bodies as it goes. It can be identified by looking very closely at its leaves. They grow in a whorl of 3 to 4 leaves, and they also have a small, like sharp-toothed margin on the leaf edges. And then even further, I don't have this listed on the slide, I apologize, but there is a small spine that will stick out from the midvein of the leaf on the underside of the leaf. And it's not shown in this picture because this is the top of the leaf, but on the underside of the leaf, you would see this little like hook looking appendage. And it is a rooted plant that can grow up to 12 feet in water up to 12 feet deep. So hydrilla spreads mainly through fragmentation. It is extremely difficult to control because even just a small portion, like the smallest living fragment of hydrilla can break off and spread and start a new infestation somewhere else. But beyond that, it also has it creates these structures called tubers. These are best described as they were to me described as batteries. So they are like the lifeblood battery of hydrilla. These tubers can overwinter, and they can go in sediment up to 4 feet deep. And in our region, even up here in, northern, northwestern PA, we don't have winters that are long and cold enough to kill off these tubers. And each tuber can produce 6,000 new plants, or I'm sorry, new tubers. So they continuously are one of the biggest struggles that managers face when they have a hydrilla infestation. And what makes it even worse is that a tuber can lie dormant in the sediment for up to 4 years in soils that are undisturbed. And it makes the treatment process very long and very difficult. And again, hydrilla can grow up to 1 inch per day. It can survive in a variety of different types of water habitats, including flowing and still waters. It also grows earlier in the year than our native aquatic emergent vegetation, which means that it can grow quickly and overtake an area. And the vegetation that is native to Pennsylvania often doesn't have a chance and will not receive the amount of sunlight that it needs to outcompete that hydrilla. So the next, I only have two more species. This one is the blue catfish. So I hope you're all familiar with the blue catfish, but it's definitely something to be aware of if you're not. It was intentionally stocked in North Carolina in 1993 for food support, but it unfortunately escaped some private lakes and commercial fish farms when they flooded. And it is native to some parts of the Ohio River watershed in Western PA where I'm at, but everywhere outside of its native range, it is considered invasive. So the blue catfish is best identified when comparing it to its lookalike, the channel catfish. So the size difference alone is a great indicator. Channel catfish can be about 30 pounds, and blue catfish can get to over 100 pounds. But we know that size is not always a great indicator of species. So you can also look at the color. The channel catfish is typically olive brown and has some dark spots, and the blue catfish is blue-ish gray with no spots. And I will say that color is not always a great indicator of species, so we should always use those biological anatomical structures. And what that means in this situation is looking at the curved anal fin. So this is the anal fin. It's usually located at the back of the fish after the dorsal or the pectoral fin, which is right here. The anal fin of the channel cat is curved and has 24 to 29 rays. Each one of these lines is called a ray, and that's like the bony part of the fish that's the actual structure. The blue catfish has a straight anal fin with 30 to 36 rays. So all you'd have to do is count those rays and see if it's more curved or straight. And you'd be able to identify whether it is a channel cat or a blue cat. You can see here this photo of Shane Henry holding a gigantic blue catfish. And this is a great demonstration of that really straight anal fin here. And I bet if we counted those rays, there would be the proper amount. Blue catfish survive pretty harsh winters and high salinities, and they are highly omnivorous and voracious. So going back to those characteristics, they eat a lot of food and they are not picky about what they're eating. They also practice male parental care, which leads to a really high reproductive success rate. And they have major impacts to the sport fish industry in the areas that they have invaded. So what can we do once we have blue catfish? So the recommendation from Fish and Boat is to catch them and harvest them. There are no weight or size limits for blue catfish. They are always in season, and you can take up to 50 per day by rod and reel. They also recommended that we report the catch. So they want you to harvest it and take some good photos, and even bragging photos are good, but also report those. And I'm going to give you some tools to report things towards the end. And this is an article that I thought was very interesting when I was investigating the blue catfish, because obviously this isn't something that I deal with a lot. So I can send this link to Aaron to send out or drop it in the chat at the end. But the Maryland governor, about a year ago today, apologies, that's tiny, but it says March of 2023, the Maryland governor called for a blue catfish disaster declaration because of the major impacts that they were having. And our last species feature is the freshwater drum. So the freshwater drum was stocked in Illinois lakes in the 1800s, and it eventually kind of made its way over towards Pennsylvania through a variety of different accidental introductions. It is not necessarily invasive everywhere in Pennsylvania, but it is invasive where y'all are located. So to identify the freshwater drum, we want to look at a couple different characteristics. You can again look at that anal fin and count the rays. There should be 29 to 32 rays. But another great indicator is this very divided dorsal fin. So the dorsal fin is the top fin, and it has this heavy divide in between. It's almost like a valley. And that front half of the dorsal fin will have 10 spines. And then you can also look at the color that it'll be gray or silvery in turbid waters and more bronze or brown in clearer waters. But another unique feature that is not listed here on this resource, but I found through my investigation, is that it also has this unique lateral line that shows up on its body. So this is a picture of the freshwater drum from the National Aquatic Species Database from U.S. Wildlife, or sorry, nuisance aquatic species. And the impacts of the species are pretty unknown. They do threaten freshwater mussels in the Delaware River Basin, but most of the impacts are currently unknown because we don't have a lot of data, meaning that it's not that they aren't impacting the area. It's really that we need to do more research to evaluate what their impacts are before we can make any conclusions. But for now, the Fish and Boat Commission has provided the same recommendations as the blue catfish. Catch and harvest them and report your catch. So the blue catfish are a really desirable table fish for serving. Freshwater drum are less frequently taken for consumption. But according to some anglers, and you can also read this resource from the Fish and Boat Commission, according to some anglers, you can take the fillets and boil them to produce a flavor that is similar to shrimp or lobster. If it's not for you and you're like, that's not what I like, you can also use the fillets or the carcasses to chum the waters if you're saltwater fishing. So I was gonna pause for questions, but I don't want to keep everybody super late. I'm gonna go right into a bunch of resources that we have available so that if you see these things when you're out there, you can report them. And that really enacts the response from the professionals that are managing these species. So first of all, we have an invasive species field guide for Pennsylvania. These are physical hard copies that we can mail out to you. And on the inside, they have species profiles. I will warn you that the blue catfish and the freshwater drum are not in here. Our sea grant program started in the Great Lakes region, so we haven't quite incorporated all of the things that we need to, but those species are on my list for the next edition, I promise. But you can see the species profiles include things like how to identify them, several photos, the illustrations that are sometimes more helpful in identifying plant structures. And they also have a little bit about how they spread and their distribution currently. We have maps in there that are statewide and national, and then a small piece about their environmental impacts. So that's one way to identify these species. It's a great tool, but reporting them is the cherry on top of this entire conversation. So there are a lot of ways to do it. One of the easiest ways is to simply go to the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission's website and report them online. I can drop in the chat after I'm done speaking the actual reporting page, but the link changes a little bit more frequently than I'd like, so I didn't include it in this presentation. Essentially, if you go to fishandboat.com, it is very easy to navigate your way to the Aquatic Invasive Species page, And you can click this Report AIS button and give all of the information to report a species. You can also report over the phone using this number, 1-833 invasive without the E. So I definitely want you all to, put this in your phone or write it down. This is managed by the Pennsylvania Governor's Invasive Species Council and the Fish and Boat Commission. And it's a great way to report species if you're, maybe not so comfortable reporting online, or if you're out in the field and you see something and you just want to get it done right away. Another way that you can report things is through our field guide app. So that field guide that I mentioned, we have those physical copies, but we also have an electronic copy that is navigable via an app. So I'll leave these up for a moment while I talk about it, but we have it for Apple and Android phones. And you can scan these QR codes for a direct download, or you can search in the quotations here, PAAIS field guide in your Google Play Store or your Apple Store. And in that app, you'll be able to see all of the species profiles that we have featured. You can also filter them by county or filter them by taxa. And when you open a species profile, you'll be able to see a photo of what that species looks like and all of the information in the field guide. And also this very up-to-date county map of Pennsylvania. And I personally update this map. So if you open it and you're looking at it, definitely think of me, because anytime a new report comes in, I'm the person who goes in behind the scenes and puts that in there. There are also things where you can use this as a way to identify different structures of the fish. So say you leave here and you forget, which one's the dorsal fin. You can actually open this app and it has fish anatomy. So you can see the dorsal fin is right here. So to submit a report through this app, it's really very simple. You hit this insect-like looking button that says report, and then you'll enter all of the required information. The best thing that you can do is give as many details as possible, including your location details and the name of the body of water. Even if you don't know where you are, just try your best. And taking good photographs is key to reporting any of these species. So no matter what way you use to report, make sure you're taking good photographs. You want them to be clear and close up, and at multiple angles of the specimen. And introducing a reference object like a coin or a camera lens, or even sometimes your hand or a ring will work. That helps to establish scale. And taking photos of the immediate environment surrounding where you saw the specimen is also important, because it can help us figure out where you're located and also how widespread the infestation might be. And I can't overestimate how important it is to pull that specimen out of the water if you can, and put it on a good background. We've received a lot of plant photos that are, hydrilla, but it's on grass. So it's really difficult to determine where the hydrilla ends and where the grass begins. So if you have a notebook with you, or if somebody's wearing a light colored coat, just lay it out and put the specimen on there and take a good picture. And then providing photos of any distinguishing characteristics is really key as well. So if you remember from this conversation, hydrilla has 3 to 8 whorls, and you can take those pieces off and take good up close pictures of those pieces. Okay, so we are at 7:33, and I do apologize for running over. I hope that you have found this information useful. If you still are sticking around and have time, I would greatly appreciate if you could take my survey that's here. I'll drop this form link in the chat as well, but you can also scan that with your smartphone. It only takes 5 minutes, or actually probably less, but it really helps me determine the outcome of this presentation and evaluates how much you were able to learn, and enables me to continuously make these better. So with that, I will take any questions that anyone has for as long as you want to keep me.
Thank you so much, Amber. I was learning a lot too.
Great.
I know we had one question We have a few questions in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to read them off. So do
Okay.
species like the flathead catfish display characteristics of an invasive species in their native habitat?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if they display those species or those characteristics in their native habitat, specifically flathead catfish, but a lot of native species do. We're working on a project right now where we're providing native plant alternatives to common ornamental invasives. And when we're thinking about some of these aquatic plant species that are native, they can become quite they're not invasive, but they're pretty aggressive. So it's just very much about knowing where you are and managing that species properly.
Next question is, can you eat water chestnuts?
I don't think so. I've never cut one open, but maybe I should. I really don't think they'd be tasty though. That outer shell is so thick. That's basically all that it is. And there are little seeds inside of that shell that produce new plants. So I don't think it would be very good to eat.
Thank you. For large-scale cleanups, does the state provide grants to help facilitate them?
That's another wonderful question. So sometimes that's the great answer. The a big lack in Pennsylvania is public funding or funding for some of these projects, especially on private property. So what we're trying to work through the Pennsylvania Governors and Species Council in being established is a PRISM program, which is a regional invasive species management program that would delegate funding from Pennsylvania to the PRISM affiliates, and that could be delegated out statewide. Um, we're hopeful that that will happen. There's a pilot project occurring right now in Northwest PA that we're working on. But for some of these other things, if they're on public property or state property, county forests or state parks, there is funding available in some cases, and you can always apply for a lot of different grants to make it happen. But yeah, cross your fingers for that PRISM funding because that would be something that would be really beneficial.
Yeah, that sounds like an interesting program. I didn't see any other questions in the chat, I don't believe. I had a question actually. So I was thinking with the catfish, like the blue versus the channel, do those species ever start to like interbreed and create hybrids that are, a mix of native and like that's a complicated question, and how do you think about that or navigate it?
No, that's a very good question. I'm not sure about channel cats and blue cats, but there are species that do start to interbreed and cause, the depletion of the genetics of that native fish species. We also see it in plants. So it does happen. A lot of the crayfish species are hybridizing, and that's creating a lot of issues because then it's really difficult to tell which are native and which are invasive.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, I think. So we're getting a lot of appreciations in the chat too. We have one question that came in. Does Sea Grant PA work with neighboring state Sea Grant programs with these issues?
Yes, we do. We have a Great Lakes, I guess, collaborative that works on aquatic invasive species issues and also a Mid-Atlantic collaborative. We consulted on Ohio Sea Grant's Field Guide app, and we also consult on the Mid-Atlantic Field Guide. And as a whole organization there's 34 programs across the entire country, aquatic invasive species is something that we all tackle and deal with. So it's something that is a highlight at all of our regional and national conversations.
That's good to know that folks are collaborating across human-made boundaries.
Yes.
I think we don't have any more questions in the chat. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask anything else? I had one more question and
Sure.
then we can wrap it. I wasn't sure if is there a like look-alike for the New Zealand mud snail?
Yes, there is. And I'm trying to remember its name. I'll have to get back to you on that. I actually have a slide from a person in Erie that studies um, native and invasive snails. And I can look for that slide from her and see what it is. But there is a native lookalike, yes.
Okay. Okay, we had so what should you tell people about dogs going in the water? I don't know if that's an invasive species question, but yeah. Do you have
Yeah,
any thoughts on that, Amber?
I don't know. Jennifer, do you want to unmute and explain a little bit about what you're curious about?
Oh, hi. Thanks for taking my question. Well, I often encounter people walking their dogs and their dogs like to go in the water. And the biggest question is it safe for the dogs to drink the water? But the question really here is, are the invasive species hitchhiking on the dog fur?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll speak to the invasive species part first. It is possible. So just like we can have New Zealand mud snails or small pieces of fragments of, hydrilla hitchhike on our clothing or on our boots, they could definitely embed in your dog fur. So I would just encourage people to you do a tick check on yourself, do a invasive species check on yourself and your dog. And regarding the water quality, I think, and the safety of your pet, I think that really depends on where you're located. If I do know quite a bit about harmful algal blooms that produce harmful toxins that can be quite devastating to dogs. But I would just be on the lookout and do the best that you can to keep your dog out of water that has any kind of scum that's formed on it, and pay attention to local signage, because if they are testing that water somewhere close by, then they should be posting those results somewhere. So it might be just, a matter of reaching out to your conservation district or your health department and asking, if anyone is testing the water and where you can find those results.
Well, thank you so much, Amber. This was super interesting and useful. I'm going to be going back to reference this, I think. And I think that's all the questions we have. So thank you for everyone for coming out to join us, and have a great rest of the night.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun, and sorry I kept everybody over.